Chapter 12, Part 3, the end of the novel. Ralph is hiding basically in the tall grass is what he decides, underneath everything. Someone cried out. Ralph jerked his cheek off the earth and looked into the dulled light. They must be near now, he thought, and his chest began to thump. Hide, break the line, climb a tree. Which was the best after all? The trouble was, you had only one chance. Now the fire was nearer. Those volleying shots were great limbs, trunks even, bursting. The fools! The fools! The fire must be almost at the fruit trees. What would they eat tomorrow? Ralph stirred restlessly in his narrow bed. One chanced nothing. What could they do? Beat him? So what? Kill him? A stick sharpened at both ends. The cries, suddenly nearer, jerked him up. He could see a striped savage moving hastily out of a green tangle, coming toward the mat where he hid. A savage who carried a spear. Ralph gripped his fingers into the earth. Be ready now, in case. Ralph fumbled to hold his spear so that it was point foremost, and now he saw the stick was sharpened at both ends. The savage stopped 15 yards away and uttered his cry. Perhaps he can hear my heart over the noises of the fire. Don't scream. Get ready. The savage moved forward so that you could only see him from the waist down. That was the butt of his spear. Now you could see him from the knee down. Don't scream. A herd of pigs came squealing out of the greenery behind the savage and rushed away into the forest. Birds were screaming, mice shrieking. A little hopping thing came under the mat and cowered. 5 yards away the savage stopped, standing right by the thicket, cried out. Ralph drew his feet up and crouched. The stake was in his hands, the stake sharpened at both ends, the stake that vibrated so wildly, that grew long, short, light, heavy, light again. The ululation spread from shore to shore. The savage knelt down by the edge of the thicket, and there were lights flickering in the forest behind him. You could see a knee disturbed the mold. Now the other, 2 hands, a spear. A face. The savage appeared into the obscurity beneath the thicket. You could tell that he saw light on the side, and that, but not in the middle. There, in the middle, was a blob of dark, and the savage wrinkled up his face, trying to decipher the darkness. The seconds lengthened. Ralph was looking straight into the savage's eyes. Don't scream. You'll get back. Now he's seen you. He's making sure. A stick sharpened. Ralph screamed, a scream of fright and anger and desperation. His legs straightened. The screams became continuous and foaming. He shot forward, burst the thicket, was in the open, screaming, snarling, bloody. He swung the stake, and the savage tumbled over, but there were others coming toward him, crying out. He swerved as a spear flew past and then was silent, running. All at once the lights flickering ahead of him merged together. The roar of the forest rose to a thunder, and a tall bush directly in his path burst into a great fan-shaped flame. He swung to the right, running desperately fast, with the heat beating on his left side, and the fire racing forward like a tide. The ululation rose behind him and spread along a series of short, sharp cries. The sighting call. A brown figure showed up at his right and fell away. They were all running, all crying out madly. He could hear them crashing in the undergrowth, and on the left was the hot, bright thunder of the fire. He forgot his wounds, his hunger, his thirst, and became fear. Hopeless fear, on flying feet, rushing through the forest toward the open beach. Spots jumped before his eyes and turned into red circles that expanded quickly till they passed out of sight. Below him, someone's legs were getting tired, and the desperate ululation advanced like a jagged fringe of menace and was almost overhead. He stumbled over a root, and the cry that pursued him rose even higher. He saw a shelter burst into flames, and the fire flapped at his right shoulder, and there was the glitter of water. Then he was down, rolling over and over in the warm sand, crouching with arm toward off, trying to cry for mercy. He staggered to his feet, tense for more terrors, and looked up at a huge, peaked cap. It was a white-top cap, and above the green shade of the peak was a crown, an anchor, gold foliage. He saw white drill, epaulets, a revolver, a row of gilt buttons down the front of a uniform. A naval officer stood on the sand, looking down at Ralph in wary astonishment. On the beach behind him was a cutter, her bows hauled up and held by 2 ratings. In the stern sheets, another rating held a submachine gun. The ululation faltered and died away. The officer looked at Ralph doubtfully for a moment, then took his hand away from the butt of a revolver. "Hello." Squirming a little, conscious of his filthy appearance, Ralph answered shyly, "Hello." The officer nodded as if a question had been answered. "Are there any adults, any grown-ups with you?" Dumbly, Ralph shook his head. He turned a half-pace on the sand. A semicircle of little boys, their bodies streaked with colored clay, sharp sticks in their hands, were standing on the beach making no noise at all. "Fun and games," said the officer. The fire reached the coconut palms by the beach and swallowed them noisily. A flame, seemingly detached, swung like an acrobat and licked up the palm heads on the platform. The sky was black. The officer grinned cheerfully at Ralph. "We saw your smoke. What have you been doing? Having a war or something?" Ralph nodded. The officer inspected the little scarecrow in front of him. The kid needed a bath, a haircut, a nose wipe, and a good deal of ointment. "Nobody killed, I hope. Any dead bodies?" "Only 2, and they've gone." The officer leaned down and looked closely at Ralph. "2? Killed?" Ralph nodded again. Behind him the whole island was shuddering with flame. The officer knew, as a rule, when people were telling the truth. He whistled softly. Other boys were appearing now, tiny tots, some of them, brown, with the distended bellies of small savages. One of them came close to the officer and looked up. I'm... But there was no more to come. Percival Wemyss Madison sought in his head for an incantation that had faded clean away. The officer turned back to Ralph. "We'll take you off. How many of you are there?" Ralph shook his head. The officer looked past him to the group of painted boys. "Who's boss here?" "I am," said Ralph loudly. A little boy who wore the remains of an extraordinary black cap on his red hair, and who carried the remains of a pair of spectacles at his waist, started forward, then changed his mind and stood still. "We saw your smoke, and you don't know how many of you there are?" "No, sir." "I should have thought," said the officer as he visualized the search before him. "I should have thought that a pack of British boys, you're all British, aren't you? Would have been able to put up a better show than that, I mean." "It was like that at first," said Ralph. "Before things—" He stopped. "We were together then." The officer nodded helpfully. "I know. Jolly good show, like the Coral Island." Ralph looked at him dumbly. For a moment he had a fleeting picture of the strange glamour that had once invested the beaches. But the island was scorched up like dead wood. Simon was dead, and Jack had... The tears began to flow, and sobs shook him. He gave himself up to them now for the first time on the island. Great, shuddering spasms of grief that seemed to wrench his whole body. His voice rose under the black smoke before the burning wreckage of the island, and infected by that emotion, the other little boys began to shake and sob too, and in the middle of them, with filthy body, matted hair, unwiped nose, Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of a man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true, wise friend called Piggy. The officer, surrounded by these noises, was moved and a little embarrassed. He turned away to give them time to pull themselves together, and waited, allowing his eyes to rest on the trim cruiser in the distance. The end. Oh, Ralph literally rescued in the last moments of what would have been his life. They wound up chasing him out onto the beach. The fire lit up the entire island. The whole thing's engulfed in flames. The boys would have caught him on the beach, and it would have been the end for Ralph. But they wind up getting rescued. The irony of it all is, what got him rescued? The smoke from the fire, like Ralph said from day one. Hey, when they're rescued here, and this naval officer, Oh, he says it all, right? Like you would have thought they could put on a better show. He's joking when he says, no bodies, I hope, or no deaths, I hope, because he thinks they're like playing a kid's game of war. When Ralph says, two, he realizes, oh my God, like these kids really are savages and two are dead. Like they're trying to process it all. And in the end, the naval officer kind of turns from them, like embarrassed, while they're all sobbing and breaking down. Like it says at the end, the realization of the end of innocence, the realization of what they've done. I mean, they now are back to civilization and are going to have to live with the murders and the deaths, which that's the whole point, guys, right? Once you forget about civilization and you forget about rules, it's like a free-for-all. And I mean, think of the times we're in right now, you guys. When William Golding, the author of this book, wrote this book, if you remember in the very beginning, I told you he was putting out a question that says, is evil inside of us, like lurking to come out, or is it brought on by society, right? Like, is it inherent in all of us, or is it introduced to us from society? Well, at the end of this, if you follow Golding's train of thought here, his point is there's evil in all of us waiting to come out. And given the right circumstances and the right situation, it will rear its ugly head. You know, there's a saying that the less civil a society is, the more rules you need to keep it in check, right? It says as it becomes like more chaotic, you need more laws and rules to keep it in chaos. Because in this case, look at the fewer rules, the less they thought there was a chance for rescue and civilization, the more they turned into savages and started killing each other. And so that's the end of it, guys. Think on it and think if you agree. Are more laws and rules better in a civilization, or should there be more freedom? Is nature, I mean, and there's no right or wrong. Is the evil naturally within us, or is it introduced by society? Philosophers have debated this for years, so there's really no right or wrong. It's just Golding says in this book that evil is there within all of us, just waiting to creep out.